All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here at the Virtual Precision Forum this year. My name is Craig Lipset. I am looking forward to spending some time with you, sharing some updates regarding decentralized clinical trials, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end. So please feel free to drop any questions you have in through the interface in front of you. Just by way of background and introduction, my name is Craig Lipset. I'm on the board for several organizations. One that I'll reference is the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance, also on the board for the MedStar Health Research Institute, the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, as well as Circuit Clinical. On the faculty at Rutgers University in Health Informatics, as well as the University of Rochester. And I'm an advisor to a number of organizations in the fields we'll be talking about, including the IMI with their Trials at Home initiative, as well as the IEEE, a standard-setting body with initiatives on remote trials. Previously, I was the head of clinical innovation at Pfizer and on the founding oversight committee for Transcelerate. Well, as we think about decentralized clinical trials over the last year, clearly there's been a catalyst associated with the pandemic, the COVID-19 lockdowns. Early during the COVID lockdowns, the initial priority for all of us in the clinical research community was on trial continuity. How do we ensure that we can monitor patient safety, avoid missing doses, and avoid missing data? And the research community, by and large, rose to that challenge, whether it was around shifts in how we distribute and ensure access to investigational product, rethinking and extending our supply chains into people's homes, whether it was reapproaching our strategies for monitoring, using more remote and centralized monitoring approaches, as well as more data-driven and risk-based monitoring. And finally, as we'll talk about here, our shifting of location for patient visits and how we were capturing data for our studies, shifting towards video and telehealth solutions in order to make that a reality. These early shifts in trial conduct were quickly seen across the industry, and this is a survey that was taken by Clinical Trials Europe in the May timeframe, a survey of sponsors and CROs that found that 80% indicated an increased use in virtual technologies and virtual solutions. That shift was felt by our study participants as well, and this is a survey conducted closer to the summertime by CISGRIP, the Center for Information on the Study of Clinical Research Participation. When surveyed, 9 out of 10 participants indicated experience a change in their clinical trial as a result of the pandemic. In the overwhelming majority of instances, this was a shift in terms of the use of telemedicine or changing in-person clinic visits to virtual clinic visits. Now, by the July timeframe, we started to see what commitment to change would look like. By July, we started to see this commitment in terms of sites indicating that they will continue to use telemedicine. This is a survey that was done in July by WCG CenterWatch, and they were sharing some fabulous data every Friday throughout the pandemic and continue to do so. In this case, we see the data related to investigator sites and the reported use of telemedicine. Prior to the pandemic, around a quarter of sites indicating that they were using telemedicine solutions in their trials. During the pandemic, this leapt to over half of sites, almost 2/3 of sites indicating that they were using telemedicine during these trials. But importantly, this last data point on your lower left, will sites continue to use telemedicine after the pandemic? Now we see an inversion from what it was like pre-COVID. Almost 3/4 of sites indicating that they'll be using telemedicine after the pandemic. That's even more than the percent that indicated using it during the pandemic. I think a remarkable shift.
Hey, good morning, Craig. Hope you're doing well.
Hey.
I'll introduce you to our chairperson, Dr. Tada, that we have live as well. Sorry to cut you off in your presentation.
No worry at all. I wasn't sure if my job was to go live right at 11:05. It's nice to see you.
Good to see you too. I'm sorry I was providing your bio, but please go right ahead. I think it's good to try and keep on time.
No worry at all. No worry at all. Well, as we were just sharing regarding decentralized trials, sharing some of the backstory in terms of the progress and evolution over 2020, and certainly in terms of the important role that decentralization was taking early in the pandemic around enabling this continuity in terms of drug access and investigational product, continuity in terms of our ability to measure endpoints that matter. And by the summertime, we're starting to see this signal of commitment, starting to see this signal that investigator sites, in particular in this survey from WCG CenterWatch, were committing to using telemedicine beyond the pandemic, and a remarkable number of 73% indicating they'll continue to use telemedicine after. Now, on the right side of the screen, how are sites using or planning to use remote coordinators? And again, seeing this trend that before the pandemic, very modest use. During the pandemic, increasing from 15 to 40%. And similar to on the telemedicine side, an indication that investigator sites are committing to change, that post-pandemic, their use of some of these remote approaches may even exceed the adoption that they had to make during the pandemic. This shift towards commitment really started to develop in earnest in late fall through the rest of 2020, as we started to see research sponsors, mostly in the large pharma side, starting to stabilize their portfolios and make internal commitments to the silver linings, to the changes that were quickly adopted during the early days of the pandemic, changes that were made using SOP deviations and protocol waivers, and moving beyond waivers and deviations, which are transient terms, and making more long-term internal commitments. And what did that look like? That meant creating teams that were looking at internal policies and procedures, looking at SOPs to evaluate, are there contradictory statements or unintended language that may have limited the ability to have procedures taking place or outside of the clinic. Sponsors started to relook at their network of partners and vendors in light of the different decentralized tools that they realized they would need, and started to look at expanding some of those lists through traditional procurement-driven processes. There's been a need to relook at training in terms of internal staff, as well as training associated with those in the field, from CRAs to investigator site staff, but also an important look at internal culture and to evaluate what changes were needed internally to support some of these innovative approaches and to help encourage colleagues to realize that change was acceptable and was going to be supported. Finally, for many sponsors, that change has included the need to relook at some of their protocols themselves, from their templates and the language in those protocols to, importantly, starting to take a closer look at their endpoints and building into clinical development plans sufficient time to rethink endpoints going forward. In many cases, the rate limiter for decentralizing studies was the use of endpoints that worked in the past, but were limited in terms of requiring visits to sites. Measurements like the 6-minute walk test, often used in trials from heart failure to movement disorders, were a great example of that limitation, requiring patients to travel or walk to a site for the opportunity to walk 6 minutes in the hallway between cones or tape marked 20 meters apart. Clearly, there are appropriate ways to capture similar measurements using digital approaches. And there are 6-minute walk tests one could download on their smartphone right now. But that requires lead time for validation and building the evidence around the quality and acceptability of that measurement for a given therapeutic area. And that lead time is certainly not feasible during a pandemic. But as we come out of the pandemic and make commitments, it's exactly the right opportunity. There's a lot of different jargon out there, from virtual and siteless to remote and direct-to-patient trials, but many in the industry have narrowed down around decentralized trials. This was the language that the FDA leadership themselves used when the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, CITI, produced their recommendations regarding decentralized trials. The CITI, as you may know, is a public-private partnership with the FDA at Duke. It's a collaboration involving many diverse stakeholders. There are a number of reasons why landing on decentralized made sense. For example, while virtual trials is catchy as a buzz term for conferences or for headlines, for many in the regulatory and in the scientific community, virtual actually may imply trials that don't involve enrolling human participants as we do today, such as the use of synthetic control arms or different types of model-driven approaches. Now, even prior to the pandemic, we saw the interest of the patient community in finding alternatives to study visits. And this is a data point captured by CISGRIP in 2019 in their recurring perception and insight study. 79% of respondents indicating that a home nursing visit would make participation in a trial somewhat or very appealing. And interesting, in light of the increased awareness and importance of driving diversity and inclusion in our trials, there are differences when looking at race and ethnicity in terms of the interest in having opportunities like a home visit, where home visits are often an important element in a decentralized research strategy. As we see in this survey, that number dropped as low as 66% among Asian respondents and as high as 85% among respondents from the Black community. And there are reasons why one might expect to see such cultural differences. In some cultures, there's work and burden that's often associated with having someone in the home, preparation of one's home, and how that differs by different cultures. In some of those communities, a home visit may actually be more burdensome than going to a study visit in a clinic. Now, during the pandemic, these numbers generally held up. SubjectWell, patient recruitment company, surveyed patients in May. During the pandemic, 60% indicated they were more likely to participate, in this case, in a trial using telehealth services. And importantly, these numbers held up internationally, and this is a survey done in the same time frame by Continuum Clinical, together with 3H Medi, which found that 60% of Japanese research participants valued alternatives to hospital visits. And now, mind the language. In that first survey, we were thinking more or looking more at home visits. In the top, we're looking at telehealth. And in the bottom here in this Japanese survey, taking a much more expansive term of just alternatives to hospital visits, which could include any type of that remote monitoring, video, or providers in the home. Now, for those that have been following this space, you probably are aware that this conversation isn't new. And I had the opportunity when I was at Pfizer to help design and lead the industry's first fully remote, fully decentralized clinical trial. We announced that back in 2011. We were working on that back in 2009 to bring that to life. That was a clinical trial looking at Detrol, but running under the FDA's IND for that and having that trial take place entirely from the home. But just to put that in context, prior to the pandemic, there's actually a 17-year history of decentralized trials. Now, I apologize if this slide is a little small. I will put this up on Twitter after my talk. So if you are on Twitter and pull me up at Craig Lipset, I will make sure that you can grab a copy of this there or enlarge it as you need. Importantly, 17 years, now 18 years ago, were the first instances of decentralized trials coming to life, largely out of Boston University at first, looking at different types of nutritional supplements. Eli Lilly was actually the first company to start to experiment with hybrid-like approaches, enabling certain visits to take place at the home using technology instead of using all visits inside of the clinical site. That Pfizer remote trial, as I mentioned, we first made the case for that in 2007, brought that to life. We did terminate that early in 2012 because we struggled for enrollment. There are a number of reasons why. We did take the traditional eligibility criteria from a brick and mortar study and just tried to adapt it as best we could for a remote trial model. But we also engaged patients exclusively online, and finding women with the severity of overactive bladder that we were looking for proved to be a challenge. We found plenty of women that were interested, but to find individuals who self-identify as having an overactive bladder is very different from finding individuals who meet the traditional, very restrictive eligibility criteria to be able to participate. Well, we published those findings in 2014, and that really catalyzed a tremendous amount of activity in the industry in the time since. Venture investment and entrepreneurs launching new capabilities, incumbents, major CROs, major technology companies that we rely on every day, launching capabilities in these areas to be able to support remote, decentralized clinical trials. Pharma companies getting involved as both investors as well as experimenters, as well as investment coming in from other atypical places, Google to McKesson showing up as investors. Now, when I shared this slide almost a year ago this week down in Florida, my footnote, my commentary to this was, we have way more supply than demand. You would have thought in looking at this slide that our industry was using decentralized approaches for almost every study in the portfolio, when in fact, it was a very rare instance to find. In most of the companies that were working on decentralized trials, these were experiments at best, a one-off here or there. And yet the market had so much inventory of capability that was being created. Clearly that worked to our advantage by the spring, because all of that inventory of capability, whether visiting nurses or digital platforms, was brought to bear. Now, when ERT surveyed around the summertime organizations around how they were shifting with different virtual approaches, in their case, generally the answer here, 3 out of 4 respondents, that they were incorporating some virtual trial elements as compared with going completely virtual or having no changes at all. I actually think that this trend that you see here is extremely important. To me, this embodies the spirit that the vast majority of trials in our portfolio can have some decentralized elements. There'll be a small number that can be fully decentralized, and probably an equally small number that will have no decentralized elements at all. And this is where you start to see this term of hybrid start to creep into the lexicon. Traditionally, many think about hybrid as, on the one hand, we have traditional studies at brick and mortar sites. On the other hand, we could have a study that's fully remote, fully decentralized, and that hybrid is something in the middle. And that something in the middle can have a few different archetypes. It might mean that we have traditional site visits taking place, but that certain visits may be defined to take place in the home. It might mean that we have traditional sites in our study, and that we have and that we've also added maybe a remote virtual site into the mix for those patients that aren't able to access a traditional brick and mortar site because of geographic or other constraints. What I'd like to do now is shift from what brought us to where we are today to where the puck is largely going, because what I'll share here in the next couple of moments is, coming out of COVID, everything in our lives is more and more hybrid, whether it's how we go shopping for groceries, or how our kids go to school, how we take meetings, or how we obtain our care. During the lockdown period, all of this had to shift dramatically to digital approaches. Coming out, the expectation should be that we're not staying in a fully virtual, remote world, but the pendulum will not swing all the way back to where it was before. In fact, when we look at data around online grocery shopping, we see trends like that. And this is data from Bain indicating that U.S. online grocery shopping rose from 3-4% prior to the pandemic to about 10 to 15% outside of during the pandemic, and that again the pendulum will land somewhere in the middle going forward. Now, why is this important? Well, I mentioned earlier, we talk a lot about this concept of hybrid trials. And what that might mean is that we have a protocol that we're defining. Visit 1 is in the clinic, visit 3, 5, 7, and maybe a few visits in between are taking place at home. In truth, when we think about consumer and our own personal expectations, if the grocery store told us that January and March, you had to come into the store for shopping, and February and in April, you had to stay home for home delivery, you wouldn't really consider them to be particularly customer-centric. And to me, this is the sign for where this field is going to be going. The next generation of hybrid trials will be studies where we enable participants to have more choice and say based on where they are in their own journey as a patient. If you're younger than me, you might think of that as Bandersnatch meets clinical trials. And if you're my age or older, that's a choose your own adventure story. This is a daunting proposition for our operations today. Our endpoints in many cases don't conform to this type of flexibility, but it makes sense. And it makes sense as we're making investments in this field to keep in mind patient preference and patient choice, and how that is not a 0 or a 1, but that there's a lot of flexibility in between based on where they are in their journeys. I'll share as a final thought here, this shift in terms of flexibility is not only going to impact patients, but will impact sites as well. Keep in mind that data point we shared earlier. 64% of telemedicine had an increase last year, but as we mentioned earlier, 73% of sites indicate they plan to continue to use telemedicine beyond the pandemic. And yet, when CROs and sponsors are working on multi-center trials, we pass down our technology choices onto the sites in a study-specific way. We know that's created chaos for years around platforms like electronic data capture. But as we're talking about platforms like e-consent and video visits, how do we start to allow sites to use the technology that they already have? Keep in mind, most all practices in the year 2020 had to implement some form of video visit. They needed to for their survival. And so in many cases, folks are already trained. There's already a technology that fits their workflow. It's already paid for. And when we show up with unfamiliar technology, we're requiring retraining, relearning, and introducing foreign and unfamiliar technology into the process. How do we realize this? With clear definitions on minimum quality standards and a focus on interoperability. And what do I mean by that? Well, take the example of electronic informed consent. Ultimately, a sponsor and a CRO shouldn't care what type of electronic consent is used by the site. Consent is a relationship between the investigator site and the patient. What sponsors and CROs should care about is that it meets a minimum quality standard and that they can get the data and information that they need around signatures and dates and versions. From there, sponsors and CROs can provision technology for sites that may need or don't have, but give sites more choice. This has to be the direction that we're moving in. Now, as a final note, and then we'll leave some time for some questions. Coming out of the pandemic, our challenge will not be if we are going to decentralize our trials, but how do we drive adoption and scale across our enterprise, across our portfolio? For many sponsors today, this is a process of understanding a toolkit of solutions that make sense for their portfolio. Toolkits are including e-consent and video visits, technologies for patients to self-report data, sensors and wearables, home health visits, the ability to use local labs or local imaging centers in oncology studies, rethinking our monitoring, centralized investigator site models, or extensions of the drug supply chain. And what will be the important step for sponsors then is to understand decision making around which of these solutions make sense for which studies in the portfolio. This will be based on the mechanism of the drug, how it's delivered and administered. It'll vary geographically based on regulatory feedback, but perhaps most important, this needs to be based on patient insights and patient feedback. Now, as a concluding note here, there are some amazing collaborations underway that are helping to drive scale and adoption. These are the places where we can only go so far alone in changing our processes and where we need to go together to improve the operating environment. I'm not going to go through each of these collaborations specifically. I did mention some important work product from CTTI, in the top left. What I will call out, however, is one that I had the opportunity to help launch at the end of last year, the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance. This is a young collaboration, but with roughly 100 member organizations, including the FDA, leading pharma companies, most all of the major CROs and tech providers that are supporting decentralized trials, along with healthcare organizations like CVS Health and United Healthcare, advocacy groups, and investigator site networks. DTRA is a space for, it's a nonprofit space for organizations to collaborate to improve the adoption and ease the adoption of decentralized research methods. It's addressing areas like our lexicon and trying to mitigate the Tower of Babel so we can all speak the same language. It's around sharing best practices. It's around sharing data that can help drive awareness and make others in our organizations more comfortable with decentralized approaches. And it's around understanding those remaining barriers to global adoption and helping to address them. You can follow DTRA online, LinkedIn, Twitter, and via that URL. And with that, I'm happy to regroup with you and see what questions are on your mind in the final 2 minutes that we have together.
Craig, I want to thank you for just an absolutely terrific talk. This was really wonderful, great summary of where we are and where we should be going. I do have one question in that, I see decentralized trials, companies using it as, for example, in evidence generation type trials, publication strategy trials, maybe even proof of concept trials, or to gather real world evidence as part of additional data to submit as part of an NDA package. But do you have examples where these types of decentralized trials have led to approvals?
Probably the biggest example today was with AO Biome, which took a fully decentralized approach. But right now, J&J was, prior to the pandemic, one of the organizations running a registration trial in heart failure, the CHIEF trial, which they were executing together with PRA as a partner, which is probably one of the most significant registration trials that was ongoing prior to the pandemic. I think, to your point, the portfolio of medicines that were in development in 2020 that rapidly introduced decentralized tools within them, interventional trials around the world across therapeutic areas, those are going to be submitted to the FDA this year, next year, some of them maybe at the end of last year, right? Mm-hmm. These are all the trials and non-COVID indications that were already running in 2020. And so there's going to be a body of evidence that's going to quickly emerge over the next 18 months as regulators are making decisions based on clinical trials that ran during the pandemic and rapidly introduced many of these strategies. We do also know the FDA has made clear there will be 3 guidance documents supporting decentralized trials that we'll be watching for. They indicated this in their PrEP document they published just about 2 weeks ago, which is the FDA's silver lining report. What are the areas that changed during the pandemic that they want to continue to support?
That's terrific. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing the results from all the changes that have occurred, because I think that we need to bring trials to patients rather than expecting patients to come to our trials. And I think that this is a great, important step.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to join you in the audience here.
Sam, are there any other questions from the audience?
Let me just double check here. And again, if you are interested in connecting with Craig, you could do so via the links that he shared earlier on LinkedIn as well. And we can always share his contact information with you after the event. And what I'll do now is I'm going to transfer everyone here to the next room.
Well, Craig, thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.